Margaret from the blog Don't Call It Bollywood, and this is the weekly box office report, specifically related to the Chinese numbers that are coming out for Secret Superstar. In general, in case you're curious, the box office this week isn't that exciting. Tiger Zinda Hai is following a natural decline. It's down to about 1,500 per screen and down to about a tenth of the screens on which it was released, which is where it should be. There's obviously a natural progression. As the box office drops off, so do the screen counts drop off. Everything's good. The only exciting, unpredictable story this week is that Secret Superstar has opened in China, and it looks like yet another massive hit along the lines of Dangal, which made me start thinking about the China figures in general and where this might be coming from. Which means I have to talk about Hollywood, briefly. Let me rewind all the way back to World War I. World War I is the reason that Hollywood became the global source for film. Before World War I, every industrialized country had its own solid film industry. Yes, films would travel back and forth, and sometimes artists would travel back and forth as well, but primarily the audience was divided by country. During World War I, the European countries lost the ability to make movies. So more and more movies were coming out of Hollywood and being sent all over the world, well, all over the industrialized world. And Hollywood sort of became the default source for film. The same was true during World War II, except even more so. And so by the end of World War II, Hollywood meant movies and movies meant Hollywood in most places in the world, unless there were strong trade restrictions in place which allowed their local industries to develop. There are a few countries that did that cut off Hollywood products. One of them is India. Another is China, Russia, very few, but they're there. And they were all able to develop their own strong internal film industry, especially India, as we know. Then, fast forward again, all the way to the 1990s. So I'm going to jump back to Hollywood in the 1990s. Hollywood in the 1990s was in a very different place. Instead of having massive studios that put out products, it had small little production houses that would get funding from massive conglomerate multinational corporations. And it was kind of exciting to be in Hollywood in the 90s. There were a lot of interesting movies being made by these small production houses, lots of interesting movie ideas being developed and funded and so on and so forth. And the primary audience for these films was America and the greater Western world, which meant that the films could have a level of complexity to them because everybody in America speaks the same language. Not just meaning everybody speaks English, but everybody understands the same slang, the same references, and so on and so forth. And while in Europe and other industrialized nations, it may not be quite as perfect to understand everything that's happening in an American movie, it's still pretty close. Things like the progression of a romantic relationship. A couple that meets in college, moves in together, gets engaged after a couple of years. That's a standard progression in most industrialized world and something that's just sort of accepted. So if you build a plot around that, that works fine. Something like When Harry Met Sally, which is all about the changing face of dating and relationships and so on, is very relatable to certain areas of the globe. What happened towards the end of the 90s was the DVD boom, which, if you're old, like me, you remember what a big deal this was. DVDs completely changed the film-going experience. They were much, much higher quality than the VHSs, which they replaced. And they were also a lot easier to store, purchase, ship, etc., etc. What we, the consumer, did not necessarily realize is that they were infinitely cheaper to produce as well. Making a DVD costs like a half a cent or something like that. It's incredibly cheap. The initial technology to develop the DVDs and promote them and get them accepted, very expensive. So there was an initial startup cost that had to be overcome. But once it was overcome, it was all pure profit because the manufacturer of the DVDs was so incredibly cheap. And they were selling them for like $35 to $40 when DVDs first came on the market. Not only were the DVDs very expensive, they also allowed studios to dig into their archives and their film library. The various multi-glomerates and so on that were running Hollywood by this point had purchased various old film collections. But there wasn't much you could do with them. You could sell them for broadcast rights to TV, sure, that was a nice solid income. And I suppose you could release VHSs, but VHSs weren't really that practical. DVDs changed everything. Suddenly, you could very cheaply release all of these films from your film library and get profit from them. Because it was so incredibly cheap to make the DVDs, even if only a few people bought them, you were still making profit. So studios were riding high at this point. Huge influxes of money started coming in towards the end of the 90s. And then, inevitably, the bubble burst, because bubbles always do burst, and also there were some common sense factors built in. First of all, because DVDs were so cheap, eventually somebody was going to start undercutting and undercutting and undercutting until they got down to the price they are today, more like $10 to $20, because that's a reasonable price. That covers the cost of production, the cost of shipping, the cost of the case, and so on and so forth. And then secondly, of course, the streaming technology came in, so you didn't even have to buy a DVD. You could see the same high quality of film through your computer. And there were also the various disruptors to how things worked. Netflix and Redbox in particular. A huge part of the DVD market and the Hollywood profits was based on rental stores, brick and mortar rental stores. They had these elaborate contracts and systems with them that essentially guaranteed an initial huge profit for any film released on DVD. Redbox and Netflix messed that whole thing up. They tried to get in with the undercut contracts, but without quite as many deals and so on and so forth, and it just turned into this huge loss for the studios. So the studios desperately needed a new source of funding in the early 2000s, and they started looking around, and what Hollywood discovered was the untapped Asian market. This is also various trade agreements and so on that I'm not an expert on, so I can't get into that part of it. All I know is about 10 years ago, all of a sudden, the Chinese market became a thing for Hollywood. The problem is Hollywood wasn't quite sure how to sell to the Chinese market. Or rather, they knew how to sell to them. They weren't sure how to sell to them and still make a high-quality film. If you're looking at distribution rights, which is what it is when you're talking about the Chinese market, they're just selling to the distributors. What the distributors want is a guaranteed profit. And as businessmen, the best way to guarantee a profit is to give something that you know has made a profit before. So what they tended to look for was stars and familiar stories. And that's why you started seeing more and more sequels and franchises and remakes coming out starring the same familiar names. Because those are the movies that Hollywood could package and then turn around and sell for enormous amounts of money overseas. This is where India comes in, finally. This is almost always how Indian film has worked. They've packaged films, the producer has, and gotten funding by selling distribution rights. But because that's how they've always worked, they're much better at it. If you say a Shah Rukh Khan movie or a Salman Khan movie, it means something much more specific than saying a Tom Cruise movie. There's a certain level of quality, a certain style, certain ingredients that are involved merely by giving you that star name. And part of that was to work with this distribution system. So yes, distributors want the one-word guarantee through the star, but filmmakers also want to make a quality film, so they found a middle ground. The same thing with genres. The masala movie, that's a great way to sell distribution rights. You say it's a masala film, you can put in whatever you want, and the distributors will believe it will make money. So Indian film was developed for this sort of rights system. Hollywood was not. And that's why you start seeing really not so great movies coming out of Hollywood in recent years, because they sort of shaved off all the rough edges. The other part of it is that Hollywood is not the same as China. I'll put that bigger. The first world is not the same as the third world. In a bunch of small ways. Stuff like air conditioning. It took me a while to get used to in Indian films that there were so many scenes shot outside and so many just family hanging around outside. Because you almost never see that in America. Because if it's too hot, you're inside where there's air conditioning. If it's too cold, you're inside where it's heated. You're not going to just sit around outside, which is something they do in Indian films all the time. Another thing, cooking would be a big thing. I have never purchased and prepared a live animal. I hardly ever purchase and prepare fresh fruit. It's just not what I'm used to. I'm used to going to the supermarket and having everything packaged and ready. It's these little kinds of things that are just shared experiences that are not shared between the first and the third world. Hollywood films in particular, if you look at, say, my favorite film of the 1990s, Sleepless in Seattle, it involves very specific references. The soundtrack refers back to old hits of America. The references to old Cary Grant movies, jokes about dating, about college, about all sorts of things that you need a very specific reference point to understand. Sleepless in Seattle was a huge hit in America, a very big hit. It was not a sleeper hit arty film. It was a mainstream film. But it's not the kind of film that's going to be coming out now, at least not mainstream with a big push. Because the mainstream big push films are the ones that are going to be easy to sell overseas, that will translate well. Which brings me finally, to Secret Superstar, Dangle, and the other Chinese market films. The thing is, again, for complicated reasons I'm not an expert on, Hollywood and China have had a breakdown in their trade agreements recently. And so Hollywood is beginning to look in different directions. If you look at the recently released Oscar nominee list, you'll notice there's very few big films on it, very few films that would play well overseas. Because that's no longer where Hollywood is looking. They're sort of looking around for something different at the moment. The Hollywood film that plays well overseas is one that has minimal dialogue, minimal relationships, minimal anything that you would have to understand the American context to appreciate, maximal explosions, and cocky one-liners that can be easily translated into any language, and so on and so forth. Now, let's look at the Indian films that have done well in the Chinese market. So far, my understanding is Three Idiots, Dangle, and Secret Superstar. These are all very specific plots, but they're specific in a way that translates across this particular border. They're talking about things like villagers who are struggling to give their daughters a future, farmers who are struggling to make a living off their farm, abusive wives who have a hard time understanding they're being abused and how to leave. These are things that are relatable across all cultures in many ways, but in the specifics of how they're shown are very relatable between India and China. Stuff like, I have never been in somebody's house where every child did not have their own bedroom. This is not something that would be common in China or in India. It's those little things that make the films easier to translate. So I'm actually very excited about the idea of India breaking even more into the Chinese market. Partly because I think India will be able to make use of this market without watering down and changing their films as much as they had to when they started going after the Western market and suddenly everybody was in these luxurious houses and so on. But also because I think it's ultimately going to help out Hollywood. Let Hollywood take care of the Western market where they're easier to relate and translate and they can do subtle jokes and interesting things with their stories. Let India take care of the Asian market where they can easily translate and do subtle in-jokes and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's how it looks to me. The enormous success of Secret Superstar in China this week is going to benefit both Indian film and Hollywood film. You can agree, you can disagree, just leave me a comment. There's a related post linked right below. Thanks. Bye.